This section from scene 7, the end of Act 2 of Der Meistersinger, is all about, you know, the kind of pyrotechnics of playing the bass. It's fortissimo, staccato, very quickly. The tempo marking is più mosso. We have sempre fortissimo, staccato. We have marcato written. You know, it's extremely energetic music, and it's going into this kind of fugal section that finishes the act. Wagner really means it when he writes fortissimo, but it does make a few problems for us. We have so many fortissimo markings in this section. I think it's quite important to make sure that we take the opportunities of having slightly smaller dynamics to exaggerate those fortissimos. For instance, if you see forte, you must make sure that there's something in reserve in terms of your kind of amount of sound. And it's also good practice to make sure that when you're playing forte, it's at a dynamic that allows you to play cleanly and evenly and really articulate all of the notes. So, for an example, right at the beginning of this scene 7, we start off fortissimo staccato, but straight away it comes down to mezzo forte in bar 3, and then the dynamic at bar 5 is forte again, sempre forte. You know, 3 different markings in 6 bars, similar music, but it's really important to get the difference between each of those, and it will actually help to get through this excerpt without, you know, flagging and finding that you've got no energy left and no more dynamic space to grow. So that's probably my first bit of advice when tackling this, is really keep an eye on the dynamics and don't fall into the trap of just playing fortissimo staccato the whole time. We can make those differences with, with both stroke and kind of energy, as well as with actual volume. Then we have, you know, the kind of running semiquavers. I find that, you know, this is quite a nice section at the beginning of scene 7 to play all in the first position, or as much as possible anyway. I don't do anything fancy with the fingerings. I just try and keep as, you know, as kind of even as possible in this register. But then we start having to tackle lots and lots of intervals of a fourth. And that's very difficult on the bass because the strings are quite far apart and our fingers are only, you know, so strong, and it's quite difficult to bar all of these intervals. And at various different times I do different things. I quite often in this section at the end of the page and before the fugue starts, I shift my intervals of fourth on a G string. But then there's also some places where it's not possible. For instance, this is a good candidate to bar. It would be silly to shift up and down the string here. But then straight after, when I shift the interval of a fourth on the G string here, because I think it's easier to play these 3 notes in one position than it is to play across the string with a fourth finger and then shift back again. So just keep that in mind when you're choosing your fingerings through this section. Then going on, we have the kind of fugal type entrance at the beginning of page 26. This is actually, in auditions, this is where I've seen the excerpt begin from, and the previous 3 or 4 lines are cut. It's really important to count the long notes to keep the tempo going in your head like clockwork all the way through this. It feels quite off balance sometimes because everything starts on the second quaver beat of the bar. But then Wagner changes it. You know, sometimes we start on the first beat, and then you'll see later on sometimes we have an upbeat into that. For instance, on the 4th line with the triplet upbeat. So you've got to be really metronomic here, and you know, I've used the word metronome. It's probably a good idea to spend a good amount of time practicing this with the metronome at slower tempos, being really concise with the bowing, trying to keep, in the lower half of the bow, keep the kind of marcato character, but without going too over the top with it, especially when you're only in forte. Then with these little triplet upbeats, again, they're kind of crushed into that last quaver beat of the bar. They are quite quick, and it's really imperative to not let those slow you down. You don't want to be late to the first beat of the next bar because you're still playing the triplet. Then we have this fortissimo entrance. I choose to do 2 bows in the long A natural. The reason I do that is because if I don't take the second bow, I end up in the upper half for the 3rd bar of that entrance, which is really not where I want to be. We've got staccato markings on each of the semiquavers. So I think it's better and totally fine to break that slur. And again, we start fortissimo, but in the 3rd bar we're only forte, and he restates the forte 2 bars after that as well. So keep that in mind, and then reserve your fortissimo sound for the next entrance on the B, which is the actual fugal subject. Then we come into this 3/4 section that finishes our music for this act, the real climax of the whole opera to this point. I try very hard to keep a quaver pulse in my head from the bar before the 3/4. So I'm hearing bom, digga digga da 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 da. Again, you can practice this with your metronome, but it's a good idea to get used to holding back the tempo from 1 bar before the 3/4. That's how it seems to be done most often in the orchestra. Again, fortissimo, but you have to hold something back a little bit. Not so much on the first beat of the 3/4, but in the rest of that bar and the next bar. Wait for the restating of the fortissimo and then the accent, and then really give it everything in the scale up the G string to the high G sharp. Con tutta la forza, this is the moment to let everything loose. And then you can kind of imagine this climax finishing and drawing to a close as you kind of descend. And slightly phrase away this last bar, only slightly. It doesn't have to be a diminuendo or anything, but we've reached the high point, and you can sustain, but you don't have to keep pushing from then on.